Good morning, everyone. I'm going to call the meeting to order. I have the time as 10:01. Before we get started with today's agenda, I'd like to acknowledge a new member of the Board of Health, Gail Mayowith, who's seated here to my left. I apologize, we'll get you a name tag soon. Gail joins us as the chair of the Community Services Board, which is the Mental Health Advisory Committee of the department. She's replacing Dr. Sandro Galea, who made the courageous decision to move to Boston, and where he assumed the role of Dean of the School of Public Health at Boston University. No longer a New York City resident, he had to vacate his post, and I'm delighted to welcome Gail. Let me just tell you a little bit about her. She is an independent consultant who most recently worked as the executive director for SCO Family of Services, which is a broad network of health and human service programs in New York City and Long Island. She wound up that position at the end of last year. Before that, she worked for 3 years as the founding director for the Laurie Tisch Elimination Fund, and before that, in a role in which all of us in city government remember her well, as the executive director for the Citizens Committee for Children of New York. She has had a long and varied career working in both city government and in the nonprofit sector. She, in fact, worked at the Department of Mental Health, Mental Retardation, and Alcoholism Services, at the New York City Health Department, the Human Resources Administration, and at HHC. So very welcome to the Board of Health. Yeah. The first item of business is to ask for approval of the minutes. Do I have any corrections to the minutes? Dr. Foreman.
Thank you, Commissioner. Nothing really substantive. I'll just throw out one on page 23. Line 6, I think it meant screen time, and line 9, other than television, referring to other screens. I didn't find anything that seemed terribly substantive.
Well, I have a whole string of small ones that have little bearing on the meaning, but I did have one on page 107. The letter I is given when I'm sure that it was meant to be A-Y-E-I, line 15, page 107. And this is the only one which I could not determine the meaning. On page 104, line 10. Essentially, we're going to make it more lively, available to smaller reporters, and to remove the fee for interim disposition. I just don't, I wasn't sure what that meant, and if it was, is that an accurate record? It is. Okay.
More lively?
More lively. Very good. A death certificate that is more lively.
I think it meant the system would be more nimble.
More nimble.
Right?
Okay.
In other words, because it was quicker.
I think that the registrar is here and he can confirm that he was correctly quoted. I'll hand all of my other ones to the transcriber, and so we can move on to the agenda. Oh, we need a vote. Excuse me. Thank you. May I have a motion to approve? So moved. May I have a second? Thank you, Dr. Brewer. And all in favor?
Aye.
Is that unanimous? Any nays? All unanimous. So the motions are approved. Thank you. So we will now move to our substantive business. The first is for the board's consideration, the resolution to amend Article 47, Child Care Services of the Health Code. This was pursuant to a notice that was published in the City Record on the 12th of December. A hearing was held on the 22nd of January, and we have a presentation from the program describing the comments and their response. Good morning. If you could introduce yourself to the board, give your name for the the record.
Hi, good morning. Frank Pasciullo, Assistant Commissioner for the Bureau of Child Care. I'm with Sonia Angel, Deputy Commissioner for Prevention and Primary Care. So we're here today seeking the Board's approval for revision of Article 47 of the Health Code. As a recast, on December 9th, the Board approved the public comment Health Code revision designed to strengthen requirements around the child accountability, supervision, nutrition, and physical activity. During the public comment period, we distributed the proposal. Sorry.
It's the same thing.
So during the public comment period, we received 11 written comments and 4 direct testimonies at a public hearing held on January 22nd. The comments were around acceptable format for medical record retention, daily attendance records, notification of parents regarding unexpected child absences, securing facility entrances and exits, as well as the supervision while taking children off-site and securing transportation. We were asked to clarify whether or not scanned copies of medical records are an acceptable retention format, and scanned copies are in fact acceptable, and we'll clarify all of this in guidance when we issue the new regulations to the child care centers. We also received comment on the daily attendance record requirements. Programs felt that requiring parent signatures is burdensome due to space constraints and may distract staff from childcare duties. And we were asked for clarification around whether staff taking arriving children off buses must also sign the daily attendance records. So the requirement for daily attendance log remains. We think it's an important feature of the changes, but we're no longer requiring a signature from the child's escort. We basically want to give programs an option of maintaining attendance themselves or having the escorts sign the children in and out. Just recognizing how the programs operate across the city. Operationally, they all have their policies and procedures implemented differently, so I want to recognize that. And we think the important part of this is that they do maintain attendance records across all of the child care centers. And staff who take arriving children off a bus may indicate the child's attendance either on the daily trip log or the daily attendance record. So yes, it is required. We also received comments about recording child absences. Child care centers felt that requiring staff to call parents when the child doesn't arrive on time would be burdensome and also distractive to their child care duties. And they felt that the 1-hour time frames may prove difficult as child's arrival times vary across the day. We were also asked to clarify how many times centers must try to contact a parent when they aren't reached. So we've retained the requirement for centers to notify parents of an unexpected child absence. However, we modified the proposal by requiring centers to notify parents, or allowing centers to notify parents by phone, email, or text, and document the notification effort. But the centers don't need to make direct verbal contact with the parent or demonstrate that in the records. We also received comment on securing facility entrances and exits. There was concern regarding the feasibility of installing panic bars in a child care center located in a brownstone due to structural challenges. We were asked for clarification regarding whether security cameras must be monitored at all times during the day, and we received a request for the cost of installing panic bars. So the requirement for securing and monitoring remains for all entrances and exits. And so with changes to the physical facilities present a genuine hardship, centers may submit a modification request to the Department of Health. If they have a viable alternative, the modification, of course, would be approved. And while security cameras are not a requirement, they're just an option for the monitoring of entrances and exits. If they are used, they must be monitored at all times. However, they can also monitor the entrances and exits using staff. The cost of installing panic bars, it's sort of a one-time investment to secure and monitor entrances and exits, and we estimate the cost to be at about $70 to $125 per door. So regarding supervision while taking children off site, programs voiced an objection to hiring additional staff, of course, because of the cost to accompany children on trips, and we were asked to clarify what we mean and how we're defining a trip. So we're proposing to no longer require hiring additional staff. However, one staff member must be designated as a trip coordinator with heightened responsibility for overall supervision. But the staff member will be part of the overall staff-to-child ratio. So basically, if you have 2 staff taking out a group of 10 children, one must act as a trip coordinator. And we've defined the term trip to refer to any off-site activity. We were asked to add a requirement for checking the vehicle operator's driving record, and also to require signature of the driver and the matron on the daily trip log as proof of the child's transfer from the vehicle to the child care center. A vehicle operator's driving record check was not something that we previously proposed, so we're going to take it under consideration for possible future revision. And we think that the requirements for documentation of child transfers is sufficient now, in that it does include the name of the driver and other staff assigned to the vehicle. I'm now going to pass it off to Sonia.
Thank you. So as a reminder, at the December Board of Health meeting, we proposed an amendment to Article 47 to update nutrition and physical activity requirements in childcare settings. These were based on the latest scientific evidence and expert recommendations. We received 2 comments during the public comment period, both in support of the amendment. The first was from the American Heart Association, and it fully supported the proposal. The second was from a private citizen. They supported the proposal and asked that we consider additional restrictions on screen time. Specifically, they asked that we restrict its use during meal and snack time, that it be free of commercial advertising and brand placement, and also that computer time be limited to 15-minute increments. These suggestions we thought were in alignment with the intent of the proposed amendment, that is to reduce children's overall exposure to screen media while in child care. So at this time, the department does not recommend modifying the existing proposal further. At the last meeting, Dr. Richardson, you requested that the program provide further details about the definition of sedentary time. You had expressed a concern that limiting sedentary time could result in a reduced emphasis on educational and creative learning goals. So first, let me clarify and define what we mean by sedentary behavior as compared to physical activity, types of physical activity, which include light, moderate, and typically vigorous are the categories that are described. So researchers have defined sedentary activities as those that don't increase your energy expenditure above, so basically your resting level. So these are namely very passive activities and include sitting, lying down, watching TV, and other screen-based engagements. Light physical activity, which is not restricted in our proposed amendment, is very distinct from passive sedentary time. So light physical activity includes behaviors like slow walking, playing, painting, tidying, and table games. And then moderate to physical activity, which is what we typically think about as, quote, physical activity when we describe studies and recommendations, that's achieved through active play, like running, hopping, skipping, jumping rope, swimming, dancing, and playing on playground equipment, those sorts of activities. So this specific amendment is intended to limit the duration of passive sedentary time only. This additional specificity, I hope, would speak to your concerns by demonstrating that activities that provide light physical activity, like painting and doing puzzles and playing instruments, are not by definition sedentary and consequently would not be impacted by the proposed amendment that we have. These activities would have no limitations during the day. Additionally, child education experts emphasize that play, which is a non-sedentary activity, is a developmentally appropriate tool for this age group, and it supports the educational and development goals for kids during this time of their development. So the proposed amendment is in agreement with recommendations for child care providers by the Institute of Medicine, the USDA's Child and Adult Care Food Program, and is also supported in the American Heart Association's comment on the proposed rule. We hope that this adequately expresses your concern. So based on the supportive comments that we received from the American Heart Association and the private citizen, along with the fact that there were no negative comments, we do not suggest any modifications to the proposed rule and urge that you adopt these provisions.
Thank you. Thank you. This is now open for the board's discussion and consideration for approval. Dr. Richardson.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the thoughtful response to the concerns that I raised at the last board meeting regarding this. I do want to make sure, though, that I understand. So sedentary time presumes that there is no intellectual engagement. I mean, I'm happy to hear that play and painting and so on would be considered light physical activity. Suppose they're sitting listening to me tell them a story. Is that sedentary or is that play or?
So it depends on if there are many ways to tell a story. There's some ways that you tell a story and you tell the children to clap and wave their hands around. So that would certainly be not sedentary. But let me also say that it's only limited to 30 minutes. And in general, kids in these age group, their time span of attention is around 5 to 15.
Still,
yeah.
So it's more than 30 minutes.
That's right. So we're not suggesting that sedentary behavior cannot be educational. We're just saying that when you engage in it, it should be limited to a specific amount of time.
Thank you.
Sure.
Further questions from the board? Dr. Brewer.
In this proposal, there was a specific, when you talk about criminal justice and child abuse screening, it said that this was not, new provision doesn't exclude like people that the parents get to take the children to school. But let's say I look on the internet and I find school bus service and it's licensed. Are they all required to have this type of screening?
They're not. So only bus services, transportation services that are employed or owned by the child care center would be required to be screened. Not privately owned transportation services hired by a parent.
Oh. And who legislates that then? So I could go and just, if any private firm, none of them would necessarily have to have that training?
No, not according to the health code. Of course, there are background checks required by Department of Transportation. For drivers, you have to have a certain class of license to drive children. There are requirements for transportation of children, but it's not regulated through the health code.
Dr. Foreman.
Thank you for really clear presentations. I'm always impressed with the adjustments that are made based on public comments. That impresses me how the system works well. I had two quick questions about the first part of the presentation. One is, I was a little concerned about backing off on the requirement to notify parents within an hour of a child not showing. I know you kept the notification, but didn't require sort of a two-way communication of any sort. And is there any concern that that puts kids at more risk? Because you can shoot off an email that nobody sees for a week and the child is missing. Whereas if you make direct contact with a guardian or parent, you know at least that the message has been received. I do understand that that's potentially burdensome, but I think we give up something by reducing that. And I'll come to my second.
Okay. So we're always trying to strike this balance between safety and viable child care services because everyone needs child care. So I think the important thing here is that that's one piece of a package around child supervision and accountability. So we think that we've built enough into the new regulations where we could concede on certain points. Yeah, I think it would be better if we had the two-way communication, but we, again, don't want child care services having to contact parents 10 times a day just to make that contact. Again, it is dependent upon them having accurate contact information, where I think we could do a better job of enforcing that and checking that when we're on site. So I think if they have accurate contact information and everything's mobile now, I think this would be sufficient. I mean, if we find problems with it in the future, we can always come back and do another revision.
As a follow-up based on that comment, is there any requirement that contact information is updated on a scheduled basis? You know, many other services we use, they, on an annual basis, there's a requirement that you reconfirm. Many people change their email or cell numbers frequently.
Right, it's not currently a requirement. I mean, I'm sure some of the good programs, this is what they do on an annual basis, but it's not currently a requirement, no.
And then my second part was for the trip coordinator. I was pleased that it did not need an additional personnel. That would certainly have been a burden. But do you have a guideline or a checklist that you recommend for the responsibilities of the trip coordinator? Head counts on and off transportation, all of the other things about kids in parks, at museums, places where they can get misplaced.
So we currently have a lost child protocol and guideline for programs. We're going to take portions of that and turn it into a guideline for this purpose, so that programs are very clear on what the role of the trip coordinator is and their responsibilities, including head counts and face to count attendance.
Thank you.
Dr. Gowder.
I want to thank you all for this really important and ambitious change to improving the safety of our children. I had a couple of questions. One is, I see that there is going to be a screening for the criminal history and personnel of child transportation services. Is there a prescriptive response to what is found in that record, or is that up to the discretion of the service?
So the service is required to submit for clearance both on child abuse and criminal review. They are then required within 24 hours to notify us of any hits, either child abuse and maltreatment hits or criminal hit. And they're also required to develop a corrective action plan that they must submit to the department for approval. So wear the check there. As long as it's sufficient in protecting children, we'll approve the corrective action plan. If it's not, we'll reject it, and they have to revise it.
Okay, thank you. The second question is, in terms of identification of children who are off-site, the permittee must provide each child with a piece of clothing and/or item that identifies and provides contact information for child care service, but shall not include any child's given or family name. I just wanted to know the rationale for that.
We're afraid that if you're in a park and you have your name on your sleeve or your shirt and somebody wants to do you harm, they come up and, with a young child, they say, "Hi, Billy, how are you? I'm Bob, do you remember me?" And the child will stick out his hand and yes, and it's too familiar if they have the child's name. So it's a way of preventing that from happening, because children do get lost in parks. They may run into not so great a person seeking to do them some sort of harm. We don't want to enable that person to facilitate, whatever their plan happens to be for the child. So we thought by having the child's name, it breaks down that barrier, and the child does think in their mind, "Oh, he knows my name, I must know him, maybe he's safe."
Thank you.
Also. Dr. Klitzman.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on Dr. Foreman's question. Has the Bureau considered requiring having owners review and update parents' or guardians' contact information annually? Perhaps if it was done as part of the annual enrollment registration, it wouldn't create any undue burden and probably conforms to already existing procedures. What do you think?
I think it's a good point, and I think it's a good idea. We'll include it in our guideline to the child care centers. I mean, these are, independently owned small businesses, so we don't want to completely overreach, but I think to support the requirement, they do need updated information, so we'll include it in our guideline when we notify them of the changes.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions from the board? Seeing none, may I request a motion to approve this amendment to Article 47? Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We now come to the resolution to amend Article 81, food preparation and food establishments. The notice for this was published in the City Record on December 12th of last year, and a public hearing held on January 29th. We will now hear from the program on the comments and their response. If you could introduce yourselves and provide the summary.
Good morning, members of the board. I'm Elliot Marcus, Associate Commissioner for the Bureau of Food Safety and Community Sanitation.
Michelle Robinson, Deputy Executive Director for the Bureau of Food Safety and Community Sanitation. Good morning.
We're all a little technically challenged this morning. We had a public hearing held on January 29th. We notified over 42,000 entities of the opportunity to comment, including food service establishments, local food permittees, and local food vendors. And we sent out a postcard in 6 languages explaining how to access amendments to the code online. 5 people testified. Comments came from the New York State Restaurant Association, New York City Hospitality Alliance, Urban Justice Center for Street Vendor Project, and Just Salads, which is a food service establishment in New York City. In all, there were 8 different responses. 3 of them were written from people who testified. First comment that we looked at was, would labeling requirements apply to juices prepared to order? And the response is no. Revised provision is to clarify that labels are required only for juices sealed in bottles or other containers. There was another comment on pre-permit inspections, and the comment was, does the proposed change prohibit a new restaurant from opening before receiving a permit? Our health code never prohibited a restaurant from opening before receiving their permit. You're always allowed to open on the 22nd day after you filed your permit application. It was inadvertently omitted from our last revision of 81, so we put it back in. So there's no change in response to this comment. There was a comment about what dispensing utensil handles are adequate. It's a very difficult question to respond to, but the response is basically utensils must have a handle long enough to prevent bare hand contact with ready-to-eat food. Single serve items, comments were provision does not adequately protect coffee cup lids from contamination. Must each single service item be wrapped in plastic? Can coffee lids be stored in stacks? Our response was the revised provision will clarify that requirement is to protect the food and mouth contact surfaces from contamination and not require any particular means of protection or storage. As long as these contact surfaces are protected from contamination, the item need not be individually wrapped and may be stacked. We all went out to local delis and we examined every coffee cup stack that we could find to see that it was adequate. Freezing fish to be served raw. Comments. The proposed requirement to freeze fish and document freezing is unnecessary, as there are no reports of anisakiasis or tapeworm infections. Amendments place undue burden on the restaurants to purchase expensive large flash freezers and obtain freezing records from suppliers. Our response was, except for certain species, fish may be eaten raw. Fish to be eaten raw must be frozen to kill parasites. Most fish is frozen by the supplier. So it's already frozen by the time restaurants are purchasing it. Revised provision to delete record-keeping requirement. We revised the provision to delete record-keeping requirement and add information about the risks of eating the raw fish to the written consumer advisory, which we also put into the amendments. So there's no change to the freezing requirement. Labeling under time is a public health control. Comment is that violations will be issued if the inspector believes TPHC labels are illegible. Response is TPHC relies on labeling to determine when food is no longer safe for service, and food workers must be able to read the label to make the determination. No change has been made. The department is concerned that labels be specific to batches of food and interpretable by food workers. In practice, if we see a label that we can't read, we ask the food worker what it says, usually. And, if they can tell us what it says, it's okay with us. Comment, when do cutting boards need to be resurfaced or replaced? No change was made to this provision. Cutting boards with visible, embedded, accumulated food and debris are a source of cross-contamination and must be replaced or resurfaced. The department will develop written guidance on safe cutting and board maintenance. Hand wash sinks, disposable towels. There was a comment about bartenders being allowed to use paper towels instead of, cotton towels rather instead of paper towels. Our response is no changes were proposed to this amendment because cloth towels cannot be sanitized between uses. Chemical sanitizers. Requests approval of additional chemical sanitizers, food-grade chlorine, quaternary ammonia. No change is necessary because these sanitizers are already permitted by the provision. Refillable returnable containers. This was the comment from Just Salad. The requirement to clean and sanitize reusable takeout containers would be unduly burdensome and is not necessary to prevent foodborne illness. Our response is that we revise the provision to allow reusable containers without cleaning and sanitizing under a standard operating procedure approved by the department. So if the restaurant could show us how they will receive and return the refillable container in a way that doesn't contaminate it or presents no risk of contamination, we'd be happy with that and approve it. With that, we invite your questions. Happy to respond.
Thank you for that succinct review of a fairly sweeping range of comments. Dr. Vlad.
I'm a little unclear about the response to the fish freezing issue. And so the assumption is that in the supply chain, the overwhelming proportion of the fish will have been frozen by the supplier or by whoever originally obtained the fish. And so what are the requirements on the restaurant or the whoever is actually going to serve the fish to the public? Other than, I mean, in the sense we delegated the responsibility to the suppliers, is there, but there's no explicit documentation requirement either, is that?
So it should be noted that there's already a requirement through sort of federal rules on fish marketing that they be frozen along the supply chain. Practically speaking, we heard from restaurants and we evaluated ourselves, and it's really not practical to expect a restaurant to obtain proof of when or where that freezing occurred along the supply chain. The requirement remains in the code, in this version of it, that freezing is required at some point. We see that as essential guidance to restaurants so that they know what to ask for the fish that is being supplied to them, or in the event that they're obtaining fish from on their own or in some other source, they know what guidance it is. The burden on the restaurants we've eliminated essentially the record-keeping requirement because practically we heard and we sort of believed that they weren't going to be able to obtain it, which meant that we wouldn't have reliable information to depend on. Rather, because we had already been providing a proposed amendment here to require a written advisory for raw or undercooked foods, we made sure that it added seafood and fish, and the expectation will be that any restaurant serving raw or undercooked fish will be providing that guidance to, or that warning to consumers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Foreman, did you have a question?
I do. Thank you very much. It's about the reusable container issue. So the most common reusable container I see is a reusable coffee mug. But you're talking about, that was a just salad, so you're talking about bowls that might be handed over, go behind the counter, and they make a new. Just practically, how is that done without risking contamination of the other food that other people like?
We watched a demonstration of how they do it and recommended a slight change so that it would be further safe, further reduce the risk. The only concern we had was that the container itself was handed with maybe a thumb on the lid of the container to the food worker, and then handed back similarly to the patron. We suggested that they put the container on a tray. With the tray, they use utensils to fill the container with salad. They pass it back to the customer, and the customer places the lid on it, pays for it, goes on their merry way. But we thought it was a safe enough procedure, potential to reduce waste.
They use some sort of disposable or one-time use instruments to mix the salad, because that's what you usually see.
Yes, the utensils are washed after each use. There's a new utensil used in this particular operation, but we will review any place procedures and determine whether or not we think it's safe enough.
I mean, I'm all for the reduction in waste, and obviously this is great in terms of reducing garbage and recycling, so thank you.
So just tell me one more time about the cutting boards, which is, as a cook, always a concern. So there are requirements someplace already, or you're going to promulgate them? Just tell me again what you said, because I do worry about them.
Well, cutting boards have
Let me just clarify for the record that Pam Breyer speaking. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
The changes on cutting boards are really not very dramatic or different than what we've required in the past. But if a cutting board is pitted and grooved, and we see food accumulated in these grooves, and you can't take a sponge and wipe the food off because the food is embedded in the cutting board, that represents possible contamination to other food that's cut on that board. Wooden boards you can easily resurface by sanding and then treating, and plastic cutting boards you usually have to just replace.
Right, and so I know that myself, but I'm not sure. This is sort of affirmatively promulgated, so if an operator sees that the cutting board is grooved, they know they should throw it away, and it sounds a little, yes? Okay.
Yes.
Dr. Gowdy.
Thank you. I had a question about the frozen fish issue. In the public hearing, there was one person who commented that that restaurants might not know the process or what might not have guidance on how to properly use the freezers or how long they need to be in there, and was suggesting there's not enough guidance to be able to do this safely. Do you think that's a legitimate concern, and if so, what is your response to that?
Yes, that is a legitimate concern, and we do believe we should put out guidance concerning the type of ultra-low freezers that would be required to do your own freezing.
Thank you.
With temperatures and the amount of time that the item should be frozen.
Okay, thank you. Second question, you had mentioned that most fish currently available in restaurants are frozen in the supply chain at some point. Have you been able to identify, are there certain patterns to which fish aren't necessarily frozen? Is it certain types of preparations or certain types of cuisines where this is not quite happening? I'm asking because we might be able to focus our educational efforts in that area.
Only raw fish only fish that's going to be consumed as raw needs to be frozen. So there are certain fish that we actually use. We call them sushi grade fish. And in the chain, the HACCP plan that's required by the FDA requires that the supplier of that fish, knowing that this is a fish that's going to be served and eaten raw, that fish is frozen, and that's required.
I see. So currently, there's no way of identifying or predicting which of these raw fish that are going to be eaten were not previously frozen. Okay, thank you.
May I just ask for my clarification how the consumer advisory is conveyed to the public? Does it appear on the menu, or are there stanchions?
The consumer advisory can appear on the menu or on a table tent or in some other written fashion so that it's immediately accessible to a patron.
Thank you. Are there further questions from the board? Seeing none, may I request a motion to approve the amendment to Article 81?
So moved.
Thank you, and I have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
No, any opposed? No abstentions? It passes unanimously. Thank you very much. All right, we now move on to resolution to amend Article 161, animals in the City Health Code. So we're going to present 4 and 5, as I understand it, and these will be presented together for the board's consideration. You could introduce yourselves to the board. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. I'm Mario Merlino, Assistant Commissioner for Veterinary and Pest Control.
I'm Dan Cass, I'm the Deputy Commissioner for Environmental Health Services.
Okay. So I wanted to go over, we did have the proposal was published in the City Record on December 12th. And we had a hearing on January 21st. We had 428 comments, written comments, and we had 12 people at the hearing, and 6 of those also who testified also submitted written comments. So that was our comment here. Okay, so the first proposal, it would require circuses and wildlife rehabilitators to obtain an animal exhibition permit from us. Animal exhibition permits are anyone who does any kind of show or brings in animals that are on the prohibited list has to get a temporary permit. We had exempted circuses and wildlife rehabilitators in the past on the theory that they had federal permits. We now want them to also get a permit from us, and that would allow us to do on-site inspections and also review their health and safety documentation. So that there were no comments on that. Were it to be approved by the board, we would do outreach to affected businesses, and we do know certain circuses. I should say, Ringling Brothers, for instance, already gets a exhibition permit from us. They did that voluntarily. There are certain circuses that use animals that we would then do outreach to and make sure they're aware of the new requirement. Okay. The next proposal to amend 161.21 and 1129. Currently in New York City, we have permits for stables, commercial stables, both horse carriage and riding stables. Also, any horse that's used commercially, either for riding or as a carriage horse, has to also be permitted. So everybody knows about the there's a current requirement that those animals have be vaccinated for rabies, but the proof was always kept by the stable operator, which presented certain challenges in terms of doing inspections when you ask the owner in the stable for the proof and they don't have it. So what we're trying to do is get the owners to maintain proof on site so we can see it when we come and do an inspection. And we would also make some changes to 1129 to add horses to the list of animals that have to have the rabies vaccination, and also, which I think is in 161 now. And also to generalize it so that instead of saying cats and dogs, we changed to animals to reflect that other animals, potentially ferrets, other animals could would also have to be immunized against rabies. So we received no comments on this. And again, you know, we would provide guidance to permit holders were it to be approved. Amendment to 16102, we want to clarify in the health code that defining operation of a pet shop or any permitted entity that has animals on site, that they have to comply with health and safety provisions of the health code, even if they're not, you know, yet in operation. So that if they're in a pre-operational type of phase, or they've sold the business and the current owner's given up their permit and the new owner has not yet been permitted, they still have to, still defined as operating, still have to, they have animals on site, they still have to meet the health and safety regulations. So we had no comments on that. Okay. Amendment to 16115. We wanted to clarify in the health code who has to obtain proof of vaccination, both for rabies and for other types of vaccinations, including Bordetella and hepatitis. Currently the health code talks about kennel. We're sort of clarifying the health code that kennel includes animal groomers so in addition to kennels and boarding establishments, that if you do grooming and training, you also have to collect the proof of vaccination. Also, to add to the health code that a box dryer with a heating element is prohibited, which is something that was changed in the state law in 2012. And I just want to clarify, you know, what that means, and I think I'll do it here. Box dryers are devices that blow air onto an animal that's in a cage. It's been groomed, the animal's wet. So there's a box dryer that attaches to the cage. The cage blows air onto the animal. What the state law prohibits is having a heating element in that box dryer. So they do make box dryers that have no heating element. We would allow box dryers with no heating element under this proposal. Also, nothing would prohibit a groomer from using a handheld hair dryer with or without a heating element. What would be prohibited is a box dryer with a heating element. So we did get comments on this. We had 5 comments from animal groomers that talked about the fact that obtaining vaccination records from prospective clients would be a burden, and they also complain that there are, you know, less for their businesses where they're not doing boarding and the animals aren't staying overnight, and they don't really the animals don't really mix. That the documentation requirements was too burdensome. We didn't get any opposition from pet supply stores, but we got a comment about improved and consistent education. So in response to the comments from industry, we're proposing the following. Rabies vaccination, because that is a very important thing. Owners would, and owners consistently have this, because this is something that we check for also, when we do inspections of owners, would have to provide rabies vaccination proof, which is something like a receipt from their veterinarian or other documentation from their veterinarian. This is for groomers and trainers only. For the other vaccinations, Bordetella, hepatitis, and a few other ones, they could do an attestation. So an attestation means that the owner would be allowed to sort of sign a document saying, yes, I had these vaccinations, and then provide the contact information of their veterinarian. And the idea behind that is it'll make it more convenient for people, make it easier for the industry to collect the information. It also does provide a bit of a, barrier to people that completely want to sort of lie about the having had it done, because you got to come up with a fake veterinarian. So I think we think it's a suitable compromise given the risk level of these establishments. To turn it over now to Dan Katz.
Hi everyone. So to refresh your memory, the Department of Health received a petition from a member of the public regarding the legalization of ferrets, currently prohibited under the health code as domestic animals, domestic pets. As the charter dictates, we're obligated to evaluate those petitions and determine whether either to deny or to forward it on to the board for consideration. And as we discussed the last time, based on our best read of the current literature and the risk, we have forwarded on to you for consideration. I would remind you that the proposal before you would legalize ferrets, but it would also impose a requirement that they be sterilized, in part to reduce aggressiveness, and also require it to be immunized against rabies and to restrain them when outdoors. We received a lot of comments on this. 418 written comments and oral comments regarding ferrets. 415 were in support, 3 were in opposition. First, the opposition. One commenter noted that ferrets can injure or kill infants and small children left alone with uncaged ferrets. And they reported that there were 452 documented instances of ferret bites in California, Arizona, and Oregon between the years of 1978 and 1987. A second commenter opposed the legislation, and many people asked that we prohibit their sale in pet shops. In fact, one sort of standard format or set of comments we got supported the legalization, but urged the board to make their sale illegal in pet shops. A third commenter opposed legalization, citing his experience pet sitting for a friend's ferrets, while the friend was on vacation, noting that the ferret was left uncaged and defecated around the apartment. We are not proposing any changes to the proposal before you. We do want to tell you that if the board adopts the amendment, we will be proposing an amendment to Article 47, childcare, probably at the next meeting, that would prohibit ferrets in childcare settings. In response to your questions, we did sort of look hard at the literature. We looked at guidance. As we mentioned the last time, the Centers for Disease Control, among other public health professionals, do not recommend ferrets in the presence of very young children and infants. The case reports of bites with major consequences were almost always to infants, and they were almost always to infants unattended. So we don't think they belong in that presence. We will also, if you approve this amendment, we would also develop guidance for pet owners to never leave them in the presence of children, just as we advise people with any pet. Never leave them in the presence of children unattended. We're happy to answer questions about any one of these amendments.
Thank you. Now open for questions. Pam Breyer.
So, I don't even want to be reminded of why we voted to prohibit ferrets in the first place, so it's okay. But I am curious, just as a well, two things, I have 2 points. One, I would hope that you would be able to get regulations out to us soon about protecting infants, like soon after we do this. I mean, I'm almost tempted to say we should wait until you have them, but I don't want to be disruptive here.
Well, let me just say that the proposal before you would not legalize them for a period of 6 months,
Okay.
which would provide time for us to come to you in June with a proposed amendment to Article 47, and for any other entity in the city to consider their own rules or regulations where they may want to restrict the presence of ferrets. So that's our intent, is to provide a period of time during which we can further evaluate this, and the board would consider an amendment to Article 47.
Well, that is a great answer. And two, just on the editorial side, so a few places in the fourth item about other animals, you made a comment that you were referring to them now as animals to make sure. But either there are no cat groomers in the city of New York, or that was just a joke, you don't have to put that in there, but could you, are they referred to throughout as, they weren't in the comments, but does the rest of this refer to these different animals as animals? Do you know what I'm saying?
I think so. I think in 1129 it talks about, talks about dogs, right? So I think that's,
Well, no, 161.15 talks about, it seems to me that you would not single out any one animal. This is really more editorial than not, but it would be good if you would be like consistent, unless you're really talking about one particular kind of animal. Like rabies, it says rabies shots for dogs. Don't cats get rabies shots?
yeah, no, it would cover all animals.
So I know. So I'm only suggesting that we just make sure that it says animals throughout.
I see.
I'm noticing that in 161.15, the proof of the rabies vaccine does say that proof from the owner of each dog, cat, or
Yes.
other animal.
Or other animals.
Right.
All right. Okay. I don't think there's someplace.
Dr. Richardson.
So I was a little confused by your reference to the fact that there were many comments saying that ferrets should not, the sale of ferrets in pet stores should not be allowed. Could you just explain that then? From where would a ferret be obtained should one want one?
So I should say that we did not amend the proposal to ask the board to prohibit their sale in pet shops. You may not be aware that last year the City Council adopted, or proposed and ultimately adopted, a set of new and onerous regulations on pet shops around the care of animals. The early draft considered a prohibition of ferrets for sale, potentially, in anticipation of the action before this board. But the final draft excluded it. We think that if they are made legal under the health code, it would be up to the council to determine whether they should be sold in pet shops. Now, as to where they could acquire them, there are breeders of ferrets. There are rescue organizations that have ferrets that have been surrendered or abandoned. And there, in other states, there is a private trade around ferrets as well. We do not want to see that kind of thing emerge, which is one of the reasons why the sterilization requirement is here.
And if I may have a follow-up. So I recall asking about this when it was introduced for publication, as to how you would go about enforcing the sterilization requirement.
Practically speaking, it's quite difficult to do so. We would regard it as certainly a guidance and a requirement. Were we to receive a complaint about a ferret, either unrestrained outdoors or unvaccinated, we attempt, as we do with other animal nuisance reports, to visit the animal. We don't have police powers, we don't break down doors, but we would essentially require proof of the ferret's vaccination at the time. that we would respond to it. Were they to be sold from pet shops, we would require that they be. Well, I don't know if we would require where the ad code require. Yeah, we would sort of pursue an amendment to the administrative code that would require them to be sold vaccinated.
And sterilized?
And sterilized, that's right. Yeah, the one thing to note is that there is a requirement, a new requirement in the administrative code that dogs be sold sterilized from pet shops.
Okay, so I'm really trying to remind myself as much as to ask for this information from you. So I remember being troubled last time at the idea that it didn't seem like there was a good plan to enforce this issue of sterilization, and the purpose of the sterilization is, I assume, to control the ferret population as well as to reduce aggressiveness. And I believe we had a brief conversation about feral ferrets starting to inhabit the very, the very old and in many ways debilitated housing stock of New York City, and perhaps this was not such a good thing from a public health point of view. Is there anything you can tell me to reassure me about this? Because the comments didn't seem to address it, and you don't seem to have made any changes in what you're recommending that address the concerns that the board expressed at the last meeting.
We've spoken to our counterparts in health departments in many states, Wisconsin, Maryland, New Jersey, New Mexico, Virginia. California prohibits it, but we did speak to them as well.
I'm sorry, California still prohibits
California still prohibits ferrets, that's right. California, Hawaii, and Washington, D.C. is what we know about that, where they're prohibited, but they are legal in 48 states, including the rest of New York State. So what we've learned is that feral ferrets have not been a problem in these areas. We also discussed with these states whether they have problems with bites. You know, they all report uniformly that they are not, that they do periodically get bite reports, but they're very rare. If this is one of those problems that's plagued by the lack of a denominator, no one really knows ownership rates for ferrets across the country, so we don't know whether they're more likely or less likely to bite, whether their bites are or are not more severe. Our best guess, based on the evidence and the infrequency of these reports, is that they're probably not more, on balance, more likely to bite or for them to be severe. However, there are absolutely case reports of very serious disfiguring injuries and worse to young unattended children. So I think we can provide some reassurance that we don't believe that the establishment of a feral population is likely in this climate and given the circumstances of New York. But that is the basis for the continued prohibition in the state of California and the state of Hawaii.
Dr. Klitzman. Thank you. So last time I think we talked about the issue before us in terms of not so much whether allowing ferrets as pets presents a public health benefit, but more whether it poses any public health risk. And as somebody who has spent a large part of my career trying to address and reduce hazards in residential and other structures, and also trying to improve the safety and affordability and quality of housing, something I know that the department is very committed to as well, I find myself, concerned still about whether allowing ferrets as pets would have a negative impact on our housing stock, particularly, as Dr. Richardson mentions, the oldest and most poorly maintained housing. There is the issue of odor complaints, of odors for unsterilized ferrets. There's the issue of ferrets being able to crawl from one apartment to the next, the albeit small risk of bites. And I'm wondering if you consulted with any of our housing partners, HPD or NYCHA or the real estate industry, or if you've considered the potential negative impact on the quality of our housing and safety of our housing as well. Thank you.
That's a fair question. I think the short response to whether we consulted was no. We didn't specifically reach out to HPD or to the Housing Authority. We did, to my knowledge, we did not receive comments from any comments on this proposal from property owners. It's worth noting that it's always within the right of a property owner to restrict pets in their places as a matter of their lease. That may well occur were this to be legalized. On the broader and the more nuanced question of risk, I think it's also accurate to say that the introduction of pets in general adds to the risk, whether it's nuisance, whether it's the potential for bite. There are definitely, we get many reports of bites from both legal and illegal animals across the city. I won't pretend that the widespread introduction of yet another species into the mix of pets may well increase those numbers.
Thank you, Dr. Foreman.
Thank you. I had a couple of quick questions. One is, one of the sets of comments referred to several hundred, I believe, bites in California over a period of time. Was any effort made to, or 4 states, I'm sorry, to confirm that? Were those just made up numbers, or was there some basis for that?
We looked for that, and there was a letter to, I'm trying to find the name of the journal, I'm not noticing it right now. There was a letter by Ken Kaiser and Denny Constantine from the California Department of Health Services in the 1990s, titled "Pet Ferrets: A Hazard to Public Health and Wildlife," that references this number. They obtained information within California, Oregon, and Arizona that there were 452 ferret attacks spanning the 10-year period between 1978 and 1987. I can read the rest of the essential case report if that would be helpful to you. Of these attacks, 100 were in California, where it is illegal to keep ferrets as pets, and it has been since 1935. Also reported from a total of 18 states were 63 unprovoked attacks on infants and small children. Several of these were near fatal attacks, and one additional case of fatal attack was reported from London. So they called reports, I presume that they got by reaching out to these entities. We looked at our own numbers. We had, I believe, 4 bites reported from ferrets, which, as you know, are not legal to keep in New York City, but we had 4 bites between 2008 and 2014 from ferrets.
Can I just follow up? Are there numbers from New York State, outside of New York City, where it is illegal?
We do not know the numbers from New York State.
Is that because they don't exist, or we just didn't reach out and ask for them?
You know what? I wish I knew the answer to that. I don't know. I don't know if we reached out to New York State. It's difficult to get statewide bite reports generally because the reporting system for them is so sort of sporadic. I will follow up though that I also want to be fair. When we did contact these other states where ferrets are legal, we did not get reports from them that bites were particularly frequent, or that they had significant problems with legal ferret ownership.
Dr. Gana.
Thank you. I think it's important that you reached out to other municipalities and other states about their experience when they have legalized ferrets. But I think the concern that's being voiced here is what happens when you legalize ferrets in a setting like New York City with such density of population and housing stock, particularly when all the housing stock might not be of equal quality. There may be some spaces where ferrets could breed and populate. So the question is really, were you able to identify other municipalities that have a similar type of built environment like New York City, where they have legalized ferrets, and what's happened in those settings? Because the settings I've heard about are places like Dallas, Missouri, that might not have the same type of analogous built environment like New York City.
One of the difficulties here is that, as I mentioned earlier, no one really knows ferret ownership rates. So that is both a denominator problem for evaluating risk, but also there's a strong likelihood that ferrets are not widely owned in most places. the best answer I can provide to you is that in reaching out to states, because the vast majority of states in the country allow ferrets, they include states with very significant urban populations. Massachusetts with Boston, Illinois with Chicago, Texas, Dallas, Houston, and on and on. I mean, all of those states have very significant urban populations. There are very few states, there are very few cities with precisely the housing stock that New York City does. Ours is sort of unique in terms of its density, its verticality, as well as the fact that, you know, a relatively small number of apartments are actually owned by occupants. But that's as much as we can.
Let me just ask a question, and then I'll turn to you, Dr. Foreman. Have any of the states which have legalized ferret ownership taken steps to repeal that?
Not to my knowledge. There have been repeated attempts to repeal the prohibition in California that have failed.
Dr. Foreman.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up. I am sort of moved a little bit by the idea of equity, and that there are many animals that can be dangerous to young children, and trying to understand why ferrets are so unique and should be singled out. So trying to balance that against some of these other concerns. And it seems like the key parts of the proposal for sterilization, vaccination, and leashing if outdoors will go a long way to reducing my concerns. But I'm most concerned about our ability to ensure that those things actually happen. In particular, this little debate about where they should be sold, because it seems to me that selling through stores would actually enable the Department of Health to much more aggressively ensure that those things happen. I'm not quite sure why some of the people supporting the change oppose the sale in stores, as raised before, and that concerns me because a sort of underground or out of the public eye market might be much more vulnerable to people not adhering. I mean, you mentioned the last time we met that the percentage of dogs, for instance, that are licensed was less than 20%. I was surprised by that, and I would be concerned that we would be at risk for more aggressive ferrets, more attacks, odor, maybe even a feral population, although you say that has not occurred, if we weren't able to ensure that ferrets sold in the city had sterilization, vaccination, etc.
So let me see if I remember the various parts of this. The first part is sort of why people opposed their sale in pet shops, and I think the basis for that is to prevent the establishment and the encouragement of breeding mills, where there's a belief among animal advocates and ferret advocates that conditions are inhumane. So imagine, you know, we've heard that they're sort of equivalent to mink farms, that kind of thing, where they're kept in very small cages and bred for the express purposes of litters and treated inhumanely. So I believe the idea there is to prevent a market that emerges with a supplier from these sort of large ferret mills. I think another reason behind it is that we've heard from many ferret enthusiasts that they take very seriously the idea of responsible ownership, and they don't want ferrets to become a kind of an impulsive decision that people make and regret in purchasing them from pet shops. So those are the two reasons that I've heard in response to that. I would also note that we received no comments opposing their sterilization or their vaccination for rabies. You know, I don't know. I don't want to infer too much from that, but my interpretation of that is that ferret enthusiasts and ferret ownerships already do that, or they would be perfectly happy to do so. Did I answer?
Yes.
Yeah,
Dr. Richardson.
One last comment, and this really goes to Dr. Foreman's question about what makes ferrets different or special. And I have to admit that from the beginning, my enthusiasm for this these proposed changes was really tempered by previous conversations by the board about the issue of ferrets during the period when they could not be reliably vaccinated against rabies. So of course that was a strong reason to not permit them to be legally owned in New York City. But we also heard about the unique skeletal structure of ferrets that allows them to squeeze through very small crevices. And indeed, it's fine to say that children should not be left unattended with pets. But I believe we were told of at least one instance of a ferret bite of an infant where the ferret apparently had crawled into the apartment through cracks in the wall or holes around the pipes or something like that. So it wasn't that the child had been left unattended with the ferret, the child had been left asleep in the crib and the ferret had somehow, I see Pam sort of nodding. So my impression about the public health dangers and the uniqueness of ferrets and the risks they present as pets was affected by some of the information that was presented to the board at that time. So that for me is the difference between cats and dogs and other small animals and ferrets, that they seem to be uniquely problematic because of their ability, and it does come from this unique skeletal structure that they can squeeze through small crevices. And that, I think, with the concern about the regulation, the ability to enforce the sterilization procedures and the leashing procedures and so on, it's really, still I'm greatly troubled by this, I have to say. And at this point, I'm not at all convinced that it wouldn't be a substantial public health risk to allow pet ownership of ferrets in New York City. So I think that's still, where I'm coming down on this. So I think there is a difference. I think equity is important and parity is important. But I think, and this actually is the first time that we've heard there are jurisdictions which have not allowed this ownership. It seemed like the whole tide was everyone was allowing it, but apparently there are still some states and municipalities that don't allow it. And it sounds like you said at one point feral ownership was legal in California, and now it's not. So presumably at some point they enacted a ban. Is that right?
If I'm not mistaken, that was back in the 1930s. But I'm not sure about that. I have it somewhere, but
Fair enough. Well, I'm certainly not suggesting that, emulation of California is what should guide the board.
So.
This has happened before with me and the board. The board forgets that I'm from California.
Yes. Mary.
No offense intended.
Just quick.
Go ahead.
So, I appreciate the concerns. I feel like our role here in forwarding this petition on to you is for you to evaluate and for us to present the evidence as best we can. We have not heard of sort of problems with this notion of escaping ferrets crawling under, or between apartments. We did pose that question to some of the states whether that was a feature in the bite reports, and we didn't hear that back. I would add to that, however, though, that again, there's a very limited literature on ferret bites, and most of it dates from the 80s and the 90s, and they're for the most part case reports. Public health veterinarians have also noted the fact that ferret play simulates sort of aggressive activity, and that that's another feature of the kind of nature of ferrets. That said, that could probably be said for a variety of other animals as well.
So,
Pam.
So, not to prolong this, but just really as a follow-up to Dr. Richardson's point. So, I in serving on this board, have an enormous respect for all of you, for the staff of the health department, and my inclination is always to follow your carefully researched recommendations. And so I too have some lingering, maybe ad hominem kind of concerns about this. But I assume, so correct me if I'm wrong, that one of the underlying reasons that you brought this to us is because you think it's better to have it regulated to the extent that it can be than not? I mean, is that, like, what has motivated you, aside from letters, and I'm sure the commissioner gets many letters on animals of all sorts, I know she does, what has motivated, I know there was a petition, I do remember that, but, so, I tend to be not jaded about that, but is
Well-
that really the underlying reason, and would you have said, no, this is really not a good idea otherwise? I know we were asked to consider this.
Right, so I want to be clear that that is the motivation here. We were
Right.
petitioned.
I know.
That's a formal process. It requires us to evaluate the
Right.
best evidence associated with that.
Right.
We've been petitioned to legalize other animals before.
Yes.
I think 2 or 3 years ago, we were petitioned
Yes.
for pigs.
Yes.
And we, at the time, we evaluated the state of evidence. We talked
Yes.
to animal welfare organizations. We spoke to shelters around the country about the kind of problem of pigs. And we also noted at the time that pigs, there was no and there remains no vaccine for approved vaccine, rabies vaccine for pigs. So that became in many ways the basis for for how we would evaluate this petition as well. And so we forwarded this onto the board because most of the conditions that were the basis for our prohibition of pigs were not met for ferrets. That's really our motivation. We really do sort of consider it a matter for the board, but we did not feel that we could deny the petition without acknowledging that the conditions previously depended on for prohibiting animals in response to a petition were not met here.
All right, so hence the response to Dr. Richardson's question about the unique physical anatomy of ferrets was not applicable in the case of pigs. So, so your answer to her question is therefore helpful. Thanks.
Thank you. Are there any further questions for the board? I thank you for a robust discussion and the program for answering the questions as best you could and as completely as you could. Tom, do you want to
Sure.
explain how we're going to go forward with this vote?
So you'll remember, this was, at the last meeting, this was, all of the changes to Article 161 were part of one resolution. We've split them up for you today because we anticipated there'd be some more discussion on one of the ferrets than the other items. But recent changes to CAPA, which is the city's administrative procedure law, would require unanimous vote to make any changes to the resolution once we put it before you. So we split the resolution in half. I'm going to ask for, there's a motion, so we have two resolutions. The first is all of the changes to 161 but ferrets, and that's number, I believe, 4. Okay. And then Article 5 are the changes that would legalize ferrets and then make changes to 161.15, which you would have adopted about 5 minutes before you vote on it. It would make the additional changes to it to add ferrets to the animals that require immunization requirements. So what I'm going to ask for now is a motion to vote on number 4 on the agenda, which is the changes that circuses and other immunization requirements, not the ferret requirement, but all the other changes to Article 161. If there's a motion to vote to approve that.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Okay, and do I have all in favor of passing item 4 on the agenda?
Aye.
Okay, item 4, circus permits, etc., passes by unanimous vote. Now we have item 5, which would remove ferrets from the list of prohibited animals and would amend what you've just adopted on 161.15 to add ferrets to the animals that would require immunizations. Do I have a motion to have a vote on Article 5?
Point of clarification. So in the past, the only motions I've ever heard the board, I've ever seen made here are motions to approve the resolution. Is it appropriate to make a motion to reject or to disapprove the resolution? Or what is possible?
Well, if we don't get a vote, to even have a vote, I mean, if we
I
don't.
just want to know what the
if we don't-
formulation of the motion
Sure.
has to be. Can it be in either direction, or it's only appropriate to have a motion to approve?
You could make a motion to change, but since, I'm not sure, I mean, I think it's kind of a flip, like if we didn't get a motion to have a vote on it, we wouldn't have a vote on it. So if there's not a motion in a second,
Is that right? So if we do not make a motion, then there's no vote?
or what are you proposing in the alternative?
I'm just trying to understand
what
the
the options-
process,
You
what
you
the
could-
possibilities are.
You could table it. You could make a motion to put it off, that would be a possibility. You could, but otherwise, we're either gonna have to go to a vote or not. So we could not vote on it, we could vote on it, or we could vote it and pass it.
So there has to be a motion to act on it one way
Correct,
or another?
correct. Okay. So is there a motion to vote on it? There is a motion over here. Second. Okay, so now I'm going to ask all in favor of passing item 5 on the agenda, which would legalize fair. So by a show of hands, all in favor? Okay, so we have Dr. Foreman, Dr. Gata, and Dr. Cairo. 3 votes yay. All against? Dr. Richardson, Dr. Breyer.
I'm not a doctor, but.
Oh, I apologize. Okay. Always better to interrupt than that.
I know,
All abstains? Okay, we have Klitzman, Gail, Dr. Brewer, and Bruce. Okay, the motion needed 6 votes to pass. Even by the charter, it fails.
Thank you, Tom. And the program. We now will move on to number 6, the resolution to amend section, is that 20503, reporting of deaths, and 20713, vital statistics. This was a motion noted and published in the city record on December 12th, and the public hearing was held on January 22nd. Our registrar.
Thank you. My name is Stephen Schwartz. I'm the New York City Registrar of Vital Statistics. The testimony that was received that was from 2 funeral directors associations in New York City, the Metropolitan Funeral Directors Association and the Empire State Funeral Directors Association. And their testimony focused on asserting that they wanted all deaths to be reported electronically. We would like that too. However, it's not practical. We have an infrastructure in place that supports the enrollment, the biometric enrollment, the training of all of the providers who use our electronic death registration system. So as much as we would like to go from the requirement now of 25 or more deaths, facilities reporting 25 or more deaths down to 1, it's not practical. And that's why we had proposed and continue to support our proposal that we lower the reporting requirement from 25 deaths, facilities reporting, down to 10 or more deaths per facility. In addition, our proposal included including skilled nursing facilities to report deaths electronically, those that reported 10 or more deaths per year. We also are asking you, the board, to approve that all facilities that are not mandated to report deaths electronically continue to do so once they start using our electronic reporting system. And finally, the department proposed eliminating a fee charged for processing what we call interim dispositions in the health code for correcting a final disposition as a result of an interim disposition. What that will do is actually facilitate fast faster reporting of deaths and registering deaths, and which is of most importance to the health department. So the new requirement will increase the number of deaths reported electronically each year, and by eliminating those fees for the interim dispositions, it will encourage faster reporting as well. And so we would urge the department, the board, to support this.
Thank you. Any questions or discussion by members of the board? Dr. Klitzman.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Schwartz. Just for the record, can you remind us what percent of the deaths are reported by facilities with 25 deaths or more a year, 10 to 25, and fewer than 10?
With our current requirement of 25 or more deaths reported per facility, we have 94% reported electronically. This will increase the number probably by just a couple of %, but it will also increase the efficiency for providers, which is important to funeral directors and facilities.
Thank you.
Any further questions from Dr. Gallup?
Thank you, Ms. Schwartz. You had mentioned to require this of all entities is not feasible or practical. Can you comment on why that is?
Among other things, we require a biometric authentication, a fingerprint device to be used by a physician, actually by any certifier in our system. So a certifier in our system is either a physician or a funeral director is also certifying a portion of the certificate. So there's a huge amount of training and infrastructure that we have to support, as well as enrollment, and especially for infrequent users. And that's why we're thinking about this in this way. For infrequent users, they will forget how to use the system. Their passwords will expire. So it would take an awful lot of support, and we essentially, when a death is reported, they're reported 24 hours a day. And even though we run a 24-hour-a-day death registration office, they don't have the capacity to support all of those users all of the time. So at some point, we do hope that we really will go to 100% electronic reporting. Some states have done that, but they have made many compromises. For example, they simply rely on user IDs and passwords. And we don't feel that that is sufficient security for New York City.
Thank you.
Pam Breyer.
No, I'd like to just call the question. I mean, I'm very satisfied.
Second. Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
I think that was a unanimous vote. It was approved. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that concludes the board's business for today. I have the time as 11.
There isn't any item number 7?
No, that was postponed. So I have the time as 11:34. Thank you. Yes, it was. I don't know. I
didn't get a recommendation.
Well, what?
Does the department support?
Well,